Welcome to IVF This, episode 196, IVF and Moral Injury. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. After 10 years of primary and secondary infertility due to both male and female factor infertility, I am now the mother to 3 beautiful miracles. I am married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you how to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you're all doing so well. This episode, like most of the episodes, comes from a conversation I was having with a client who was talking about the possibility of taking a break from treatment and why the idea of taking a break felt so quote unquote wrong to her. And as we were talking, a lot of the real issues started to come to light. There's a very specific kind of pain that happens when you're forced to make decisions you never consented to making. And then you're left alone to live with the cost of those decisions. Not because you did something wrong, but because there were no clean options. If you've been through IVF, there's a really good chance that you have felt this even if you never had the language for it. And that pain has a name, and it's called moral injury. And today I want to talk to you about why IVF creates moral injury in ways people don't always recognize, and why so many of us carry this quietly, wondering, what the hell's wrong with me? So, what is a moral injury? A moral injury is not guilt. It's not shame. It's not regret. Moral injury happens when you are placed in impossible situations with no clean choices that conflict with your values, identity, and sense of self. And you have to decide anyway. It happens when survival overrides self-trust. And IVF does this over and over and over and over and over again. Moral injury isn't about doing something wrong. It's about being forced to make a decision or decisions within a system that was never built or designed to preserve your humanity. Now, when people hear the term moral injury, they often assume that it only applies if IVF conflicts with their religion, their spirituality, or decisions about embryos. And yes, those absolutely count. They are very real, very valid forms of moral injury. But that is not the only place this injury shows up. In fact, some of the deepest moral injuries in IVF have nothing to do with religion and everything to do with what IVF quietly asks you to override in yourself. For some people, IVF creates moral injury through embryo creation, freezing, donation, or discarding, faith-based or spiritual conflict, feeling at odds with God, the universe, faith, or a belief system that once felt grounding. If IVF cracked open questions you have never wanted to ask or placed you in decisions that didn't align with who you are or who you were raised or what you believe is quote unquote right, that matters and that still counts. But I want to talk about the sneaky side of moral injury. The areas that moral injury hides within IVF. First place, self-betrayal in the name of hope. Have you ever continued a cycle that you knew you just did not have the capacity for, but you told yourself you would deal with the fallout later? Have you ever said, I can handle it, when the quieter voice inside you knows that you couldn't? That moment when survival overrides self-trust is a moment of moral injury. Not because you are weak, but because you were desperate, hopeful, and most importantly, human. IVF often requires you to override self-protection in order to keep going. And later, we often judge ourselves for that without acknowledging the conditions that you're under. and how many of us tell ourselves this is the only way. Another way it sneaks in on us is performing gratitude instead of telling the truth. This one is subtle, but it's still corrosive. At least you can try IVF. So many people would be grateful for this opportunity. You're so lucky to have options. When you learn to perform gratitude instead of telling the truth about how devastated you are, the injury isn't sadness. The injury is the silencing. You didn't just swallow your pain, you learned to doubt its legitimacy. Moral injury isolates people because people assume that the problem is their feelings, when the real issue is the position you have been put in. Another area is medical compliance versus an inner knowing. IVF trains people to comply, to follow protocols, to defer to authority, to silence intuition, to override bodily signals, to keep going even when something inside of you whispers, this is too much. Again, later comes the judgment. We judge ourselves for not advocating more, for not stopping sooner, for not trusting ourselves. But what rarely gets acknowledged is the system, the IVF system, the biomedical system of IVF required compliance for continuation. It's not a personal failing, that's conditioning. Then there's relationship-based moral injury. Sometimes the injury isn't conflict, sometimes it's compromise. Continuing treatment for a partner when you're already completely depleted. Stopping treatment for a partner when you weren't ready. Carrying more of the emotional labor because you're better at it, quote unquote, better at it. Sometimes moral injury is this thought: I protected the relationship by abandoning parts of myself. You didn't choose wrong, you chose connection. And that choice can still leave a wound. There's the identity fracture that so many people experience during infertility. If you've ever thought, this isn't who I am, I don't even recognize myself anymore. I'm strong. I thought I was strong, but I'm not handling this well. That is not a character flaw or deficit. That's what happens when your values and your survival are pulling in opposite directions. You didn't lose yourself, you adapted, and adaptation always has a cost. IVF quietly reinforces what society has already taught us: that stopping means giving up, that rest means failure, and that doubt means negativity. Hope becomes this mandatory burden instead of something that we're choosing. And when hope becomes an obligation, stopping can feel like a moral failure. And for many people, taking a break doesn't feel neutral, it feels dangerous. Like collapse, like abandonment, like something you won't survive. And that's not you being dramatic, that's your nervous system learning that pushing through was how you stayed intact. Your nervous system isn't punishing you, it's trying to reconcile who you are with what you had to do. IVF as a medical process asks different things of us than IVF as the lived experience. And moral injury happens when those two things collide. Now, before we talk about healing moral injury, because I'll get into that, we need to be very clear about what it is not. Because so many people carrying injuries have mislabeled them as personal failings. Moral injury is not weakness. Needing to keep going does not mean you lacked boundaries. It means your nervous system prioritized the thing that told it it would survive, which is continuing to have the family that you want, the baby, the pregnancy, all things. When I say survival, that's what I mean, right? Your brain is just interpreting survival as attaining these things that you are desperately longing for. Moral injury is not hypocrisy.
Changing what you could tolerate over time does not mean that you have betrayed your values. It means that context changed faster than your values could adjust. Moral injury is not a lack of faith, optimism, or resilience. Questioning God, the universe, medicine, or yourself is not a spiritual failing. It's what happens when certainty collapses. Moral injury is not doing IVF wrong. There is no version of IVF where you come out untouched. I hate to be the person that tells you this. Actually, I love to be the person that tells you this because I want to be the soft place that you land, but also realistic. You don't come out unscathed. You don't come out untouched. If you feel marked by it, that doesn't mean that you failed or that you are weak. It means that you were paying attention. Moral injury is not something you should just be over by now. It doesn't resolve on a timeline because it's not about the event. It was never about the event. It's about the meaning your nervous system is still holding. Moral injury lives where self-judgment moved in too fast and context was never applied. Healing moral injury is not about absolution. It's not about forgiveness. It's not about deciding it was quote unquote worth it. And it's definitely not about finding a silver lining. You know, that's not what I'm about. Healing moral injury requires contextualization, witnessing, and integration. So, first step, context before conclusion. Before you decide what a choice says about you, you have to understand and be willing to accept the conditions under which that decision was made, which are generally urgency, fear, grief, hope, and a lack of true alternatives. This isn't about excusing anything, it's about locating and reorienting. You cannot judge a decision accurately without accounting for the terrain in which the decision was made. Witnessing without fixing. Most people try to heal moral injury by explaining it away. But moral injury heals through being witnessed without someone trying to redeem it. You don't need someone to tell you it was worth it. You need someone to tell you, of course that hurt. Of course that was hard. Another aspect of moral injury healing, separating values from circumstances. What you had to do in an impossible system is not a pure reflection of who you are. Your values can remain intact even when your behavior was tightened, was constrained, was narrowed. Who you are is not reducible to the worst position you were placed in. And that line goes way further than IVF. I hope that one sinks in. I gotta be honest, I feel really proud about that line. The fourth aspect is allowing grief without verdict. Grieving the cost, not just the financial cost, the mental, physical, emotional cost of IVF does not mean that you regret your choices. It means that you're telling the truth about what it looked like. You're allowed to hold gratitude and grief without forcing them to cancel each other out. And finally, letting meaning emerge, not forcing it. Sometimes the most respectful thing that we can do with moral injury is to stop asking it to teach us something. Not everything has a lesson. Some things just deserve honesty. If IVF has asked you to carry decisions you never should have had to make, and parts of you still ache around that, doesn't mean you failed your values. Doesn't mean you failed yourself or anyone else. It means you were human inside a system, inside a situation that demanded too much from you. Moral injury does not mean you broke yourself. It means you survived something that required you to bend. And that deserves reverence and compassion, not persecution. And that is what I have for you this week, my friends. I hope you have a beautiful week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.